Rain slammed the front windows hard enough to make the old panes shiver, and every thunderclap felt like somebody kicking the door I couldn't afford to replace. I had a rent notice folded in my apron pocket, the kind printed on thin paper that still managed to feel heavy. An extra $1,200 due by next week, or the locks would change. Like I hadn't already been stretching every dollar until it squealed. Ruby sat on the last open bar stool with her knees tucked up, coloring on the back of a flyer because we were out of clean coloring books again. Her lashes kept dipping, fighting sleep the way only a 6-year-old can, stubborn and brave. I kept wiping the same counter, not because it was dirty, but because my hands needed something to do besides shake. Outside, Chicago turned into a watercolor of headlights and rain. Wind shoved the striped awning like it was trying to rip it free. I told myself to close early, to get Ruby upstairs, to pretend tomorrow wasn't waiting with another bill. Then lightning stitched the street bright for half a second, and I saw a small shape tucked under the awning's edge. Not a grown man. Not someone looking to rob me. A kid, tiny shoulders hunched, a backpack clutched like it was the only thing keeping him standing. My first instinct was the one I'd learned the hard way. Do not open the door at night. This neighborhood didn't reward softness. But then Ruby shifted in her seat, made a sleepy little sound, and my chest tightened with a thought I couldn't swallow down. What if that were my child, alone in this storm, waiting for someone to choose them? I grabbed my keys, held my breath, and unlocked the deadbolt. The bell above the door trembled as I pulled it open, letting cold air and rain mist rush in with him. His eyes lifted to mine, too steady, too aware, like he'd been taught to look for danger before comfort. I didn't know that opening that door was the moment my old life started counting down. The warmth hit him first. I could see it in the way his shoulders loosened by a fraction, even while the rest of him stayed locked down tight. The cafe smelled like wet wool, cinnamon from the day's last batch of muffins, and old paper from the shelves of used books that never quite sold. Behind us, the storm kept trying to claw its way in rain, rattling the windows, wind shoving at the awning, but inside it was quieter, like the building was holding its breath. I shut the door fast, slid the deadbolt into place, and kept my body between him and the street without even thinking about it. The bell above the frame gave a small, nervous shake. My hands moved automatically, the way they always did when Ruby scraped her knee or came down with a fever. Towel first, warmth second, questions later. Up close, he looked even smaller. 7, maybe. His hair was dark and pasted to his forehead, water dripping onto a designer-looking collar that didn't belong anywhere near my scuffed tile floor. He wore a raincoat that still held its shape despite being soaked through, the kind of thing I'd see on a kid stepping out of a car in a nicer neighborhood. His sneakers were too clean to be real for this side of town, even with the puddles he'd just walked through. Expensive kid, lost kid. That combination made my stomach tighten. I guided him toward the nearest table, the one under the pendant light that flickered when the espresso machine kicked on. He didn't wander. He didn't look around like a curious child taking in a new place. He tracked the room like he was mapping exits, counting angles, measuring the distance between himself and the door. Those eyes, not wide with fear, not watery with panic, just alert, like he'd been taught to stay ready. Ruby's head lifted from the bar stool. Her crayon paused mid-stroke. She blinked at him, then at me, trying to figure out whether this was danger or a late-night customer. I softened my face for her, because kids read your expression before they understand the words. I found a clean dish towel and gently pressed it into the boy's hands, showing him how to rub his hair without making a big deal out of it. He did it with careful efficiency, the kind of motion that looked practiced. He kept his backpack close, straps wrapped around his wrists like cuffs. When I reached for it more out of habit than anything, his fingers tightened so fast I almost missed it. A reflex, a silent line drawn, so I backed off. I let him keep it. I let him keep control over the one thing he'd managed to hold on to. I made hot chocolate because I didn't know what else to do. Because warmth is the closest thing to comfort I can manufacture on command. The kettle hissed, steam fogged the window, and the mugs clinked like tiny alarms in the quiet. I added extra marshmallows the way I do for Ruby when the day has been too heavy for her small shoulders. When I set the mug down in front of him, he didn't gulp. He waited. He watched me pick up my own cup first, like he needed proof it was safe. Then he took a careful sip, eyes still scanning past me to the windows and the door. I told myself not to judge. Some kids are anxious. Some kids have been through things. But the way he held himself spine straight, chin level, shoulders not slumped from cold so much as braced against it, felt older than his face. In my mind, I gave him a name, before he offered one. Eli fit him. Short, simple, solid. And when he finally gave me that name in the smallest nod of confirmation, it landed like a fact, not an introduction. Like he'd been trained to offer only what was necessary. Ruby slid off her stool and patted closer, still half asleep. She didn't ask questions. She just brought her coloring flyer and set it on the table like a peace offering, then climbed into the chair beside me and leaned into my arm. She smelled like strawberry shampoo and sleep. Her presence made the room feel less sharp. Eli's gaze flicked to her, then away, then back again. Not interested in her drawing so much as noticing the way she trusted me, the way she existed without fear in a place that should have been scary. Something in his face shifted so quick I might have imagined it like he was trying to remember what that felt like. I stayed steady. I kept my voice low. I told myself I could call someone, that there had to be a parent somewhere panicking the way I would if Ruby vanished. But every time my eyes drifted toward my phone on the counter, Eli's posture tightened, and a hard little focus settled over him. Not tantrum, not pleading. Just a shut door behind his eyes. He gave me fragments instead of a story. A place he'd been earlier. A moment where people ran. A separation. The way he described it didn't feel like a kid reliving chaos. It felt like he was reciting what he'd been instructed to say if he ever got lost. And when I tried to guide him toward normal details, an address, a last name, his words thinned out, careful and measured, like he was afraid of saying the wrong thing. Outside, the storm eased for a second, then slammed back harder. Headlights smeared across the wet street. A deep engine note rolled by and slowed, not like a car passing through but like something settling in. My skin prickled. The neighborhood had its share of late-night drivers, sure. But there was a weight to that sound. A smoothness that didn't match the usual battered sedans on Harmon Street. Eli heard it too. He moved so fast the chair barely squeaked. 1 second he was sitting upright with his hands around the mug. The next, he was down, tucked beneath the table with his knees to his chest, backpack pressed tight, his head angled toward the window like he was listening for a second cue. It wasn't panic. It was procedure. Like his body knew what to do before his brain had time to argue. Ruby startled at the sudden movement, her fingers gripping my sleeve. I wrapped my arm around her and forced my face into calm, even though my heartbeat was slamming against my ribs. My eyes went to the window, to the street beyond the fogged glass, trying to see through rain and reflection. A black SUV sat near the curb, lights dimmed, idling too quietly to be normal. It lingered in a way that made my mouth go dry. I couldn't tell if it was watching my cafe or just waiting out the weather. But Eli's reaction made the answer feel obvious. My first instinct was to lock everything tighter, to pull Ruby upstairs and pretend none of this was happening. But Eli was under my table like a kid who had practiced hiding more times than he'd practiced spelling words. A kid with expensive shoes and a survival response. A kid who didn't belong here, and definitely didn't belong alone. I crouched slightly, keeping my movements slow so I didn't scare Ruby. I reached down, not touching Eli, just letting my hand rest on the table edge as a signal that I was there. In that moment, I understood something without having proof. If whoever was outside wanted him, they wouldn't hesitate to come in. And if I called the police, I'd be inviting more noise, more attention, more chaos. In this city, flashing lights didn't always mean safety. Sometimes they just meant everyone showed up. The SUV rolled forward a few feet, then stopped again. My throat tightened. I didn't have the luxury of waiting to see what it would do next. I had Ruby. I had a cafe I couldn't afford to lose. And now, somehow, I had Eli. I made a decision the way single moms do, fast, ugly, and with a prayer that it wasn't the wrong one. I was going to get him out of here. I was going to get him home, whatever home meant in his world. Because leaving him under my table while a black SUV idled outside felt like handing him back to the storm. And once that thought settled in, there was no going back. I moved like my life had a timer on it. First, I killed the lights over the pastry case. Then I flipped the sign to closed with fingers that didn't feel like mine. I kept my voice low for Ruby. Even though my nerves were screaming, I didn't reach for my phone. Not because it wasn't the right thing to do, but because the second my hand drifted toward it, Eli's whole body tightened again, like the sight of a screen could set off an alarm in him. And because calling strangers with badges into my little cafe at night felt like opening a second door I couldn't close. Ruby rubbed her eyes and leaned into my hip while I shoved my rent notice deeper into my apron, like paper could be hidden from reality. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and Ruby's coat, then found the courage to bend down near the table where Eli had folded himself away. I didn't touch him. I just let him see my hands were empty, my posture calm, my intentions plain. After a beat, he slid out like a shadow, backpack still strapped tight, hair dripping onto my floor. The SUV was still out there. Not close enough to prove anything, but close enough to make my skin itch. I herded us toward the back entrance instead of the front, the way I do when I don't want Ruby walking past loitering men on the corner. The alley smelled like wet trash and gasoline. Rain ran in thin streams down the brick, and my boots splashed through puddles that caught the streetlight like broken glass. My old car waited behind the cafe, tired and loyal and a little embarrassing. I unlocked it with the key fob that only worked if I pressed it twice and prayed. Ruby climbed into the back seat with the trust of someone who still believes her mom can fix anything. I buckled her in, tugged the strap snug, and tucked her small blanket around her shoulders. Then I opened the front passenger door for Eli. He got in fast. He didn't hesitate or look around like a kid who'd never been in a stranger's car. He sat, closed the door, and clicked his seatbelt into place with a crisp, practiced motion. His hands returned to his backpack immediately, holding it tight against his chest. His eyes didn't settle on the dashboard or the glove compartment. They went to the side mirrors, the rear view, the dark edges of the alley beyond my windows. He tracked angles the way other children track cartoons. The heater coughed out lukewarm air. The windshield wipers squealed across the glass, smearing rain into blurry streaks. I pulled out slow, tires hissing on wet pavement, and told myself I was doing a good thing. I also told myself I might be doing a stupid thing. That's the problem with being a single mom. You don't get to choose between safe and brave. You choose whatever keeps your kid breathing, and hope the rest can be cleaned up later. Ruby's head tipped to the side, half asleep again, her mouth slightly open. Hearing her soft breathing should have calmed me. Instead, it sharpened everything. Every sound outside felt louder. Every headlight felt like a question. I tried to get something simple from Eli, the kind of detail that would let me type an address into my phone and follow the blue line like a normal person. But he didn't give me numbers. He didn't give me a street name I could recognize. What he offered came out in careful pieces, like he'd memorized them for an emergency. He couldn't tell me a phone number, and the way he avoided the topic felt rehearsed, almost panicked underneath his control. He couldn't tell me a normal address, either. Instead, he painted a picture, a neighborhood that wasn't mine, streets cleaner than mine, gates taller than anything I'd ever touched. He described black iron fencing and cameras that looked like little dots tucked under eaves. He mentioned stone animals at an entrance. Not in a childlike way, but in a way that sounded like identification. Like, if you see the wolves, you're in the right place. If you see the lions, you're too far. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands steady on the wheel, but inside I felt my certainty slide away. A kid who lived behind gates didn't end up soaked under my awning by accident. A kid who spoke in landmarks and security features didn't come from a home where bedtime was just bedtime. We rolled through my side of the city first, past the corner store with the busted sign, past the bus stop where someone always slept on the bench, past a line of taillights shining red through the rain, neon reflected off puddles like spilled paint. The streets were slick and dark, and the storm turned everything into a tunnel. At the first long stoplight, I checked my rearview mirror without making it obvious. One car behind me, another behind that. Nothing unusual. I told myself I was imagining things because I was tired and scared. Then the light changed, and the car behind me moved when I moved. That was normal too. But at the next turn, when I signaled right, it turned right. When I merged left to avoid a stalled delivery truck, it merged left. When I slowed for a pothole, it slowed at the exact same beat, like we were connected by an invisible rope. Eli noticed before I did. His gaze kept flicking to the mirror, then to the side window, then back to the mirror again. His jaw tightened. His shoulders rose by a fraction, like he was preparing to disappear. My palms started to sweat against the steering wheel. I told myself to breathe. Ruby shifted in the back seat, made a small, sleepy sound, and I swallowed hard. I couldn't panic. Not with her back there, not with him beside me. I tried a simple test. I took a turn I didn't need, down a street lined with closed storefronts and dark apartments. The car followed. I turned again, a pointless loop around a block. It followed again, smooth and patient, never rushing, never falling too far back. That's when my throat went dry, because normal drivers don't follow pointless loops at night in the rain. At the next light, an engine rumbled somewhere nearby, deeper than the others. And Eli folded down instinctively, sliding low in his seat like he'd practiced it 100 times. Not a kid playing, Not a kid hiding in a game. A kid executing a drill. My heart kicked hard. I kept my face neutral and my hands steady, like calm could be contagious. Ruby blinked awake for a second, confused, and I reached back without looking to rest my fingertips on her knee. A silent promise that she was safe, even if I didn't feel safe at all. The city began to change as we drove. The buildings spaced out. The sidewalks looked cleaner. Streetlights were brighter, whiter. The potholes disappeared. Trees showed up in neat rows like somebody paid them to stand straight. The kind of neighborhood where my car looked like it had taken a wrong turn and never recovered. And the car behind me was still there. It wasn't even trying to hide now. It sat at the same distance, held the same speed, matched my lane changes like it had my route printed in its hands. I didn't know if it was coming for Eli, watching Eli, protecting Eli, or watching me. I only knew I didn't like being part of anyone's plan. Eli's description narrowed, the way a GPS voice narrows when you're close to your destination. He pointed out an entrance that sounded more like a checkpoint than a neighborhood sign. He mentioned decorative stone at the borders, cameras disguised as lights, gates that didn't open for strangers. When I finally saw it, tall iron fencing, a wide private road, a guard booth set back behind landscaping, I felt my stomach drop. The rain thinned to a mist, and everything ahead looked too clean, too controlled, too far from my real life. I slowed at the threshold, my wipers still ticking like a metronome, and I realized with a cold clarity that I wasn't just returning a lost kid. I was driving straight into his world. The entrance didn't look like a neighborhood so much as a border. A low stone wall ran along the road with manicured shrubs planted like soldiers, and behind it, iron fencing rose tall enough to make my throat tighten. Cameras sat in the corners of decorative lights, small black dots pretending to be part of the landscaping. Even in the rain, everything looked polished. Streets swept clean, trees pruned to the same height, sidewalks empty like people here had better places to be than outside at night. I slowed my old car to a crawl, wipers ticking, heater wheezing, and I waited for the moment someone would step out of a booth and ask what I thought I was doing. Instead, the gate began to open. No intercom, no pause, no question. It swung inward on silent hinges like we'd been expected, like my beat-up vehicle and my exhausted single-mom face had already been scanned, measured, and approved for entry. My stomach dipped. I didn't like how invisible that made me feel. Like privacy here wasn't a privilege, it was a weapon. Ruby stirred in the back seat when the car rolled over the smooth private road. She made a sleepy sound, her blanket bunched under her chin. I reached back for her hand for half a second, just enough to steady myself, and she squeezed without fully waking. That small trust hit me harder than the gate. Eli's posture changed the moment we crossed the threshold. It was subtle, but I saw it. The slight slump of a wet kid in a stranger's car disappeared. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted. His hands still clutched the backpack, but now it sat perfectly centered on his lap, straps aligned like he'd been corrected before. His eyes stopped, scanning wildly, and started scanning deliberately, like he was slipping a mask back into place. He wasn't relaxing because he was home. He was performing because he was being watched. The road curved through rows of large homes set back behind trees and privacy hedges. Lights glowed warm through tall windows, and every driveway had its own set of cameras tucked into stone pillars. It felt like a place built to keep the world out, and to keep certain things in. We turned again, deeper, until the houses thinned and the property lines widened. Then the real gate appeared, black iron bars thicker than my wrist, flanked by stone pillars and sculpted animals perched like sentries. The decor wasn't cute, it was symbolic. It said, "You are entering a place that does not negotiate." As I pulled closer, the second gate opened too. Just like that. I barely had time to breathe before my headlights hit a wide circular driveway slick with rain. 3 black SUVs were parked in a loose arc in front of a massive house that didn't scream new money. It whispered old power. Clean lines, pale stone, low lighting that made the place look calm while still making it impossible to approach unseen. Men in dark suits stood near the entrance, shoulders broad under rain-darkened fabric, earpieces catching the light. They didn't rush toward me like frantic parents. They watched first. I felt it, the silent evaluation, how my car looked, how my hands held the steering wheel, the way Ruby's small face was visible in the back seat, the way my wet coat clung to my shoulders like a confession that I did not belong here. I swallowed and parked where the curve of the driveway seemed to insist. Before I could even reach for the handle, a suited man stepped forward and opened Eli's door from the outside. Not gently, not roughly, efficiently. Like this was a routine that happened too often. Eli slid out without hesitation. He didn't look back at me the way a kid normally would, checking if the adult who helped him was still there. He moved with the smooth obedience of someone returning to a system. I got out slowly, rain immediately soaking my hair again. The cold hit my lungs. I went around to Ruby's side, unbuckled her carefully, and lifted her into my arms. She blinked at the bright driveway lights, confused but calm. I kept my cheek pressed to her head as if I could shield her from everything with just that. The suited men didn't stare at Ruby. That almost made it worse. They treated her like a detail, not a person, which told me they were trained to keep emotion out of their faces. The front door opened, and warm light spilled across the wet stone, making the rain look like glitter for 1 second. A woman appeared, first elegant in a way that felt sharp, clipboard held close, eyes flicking from Eli to me like she was already cataloging risks. Behind her came the man who changed the temperature of the entire driveway just by existing in it. Damian Blackwell. I didn't know his name yet, not in that first instant, but I knew the shape of power when I saw it. He was in his early 30s, tall without trying to look tall, dressed in a dark coat that fit like it had been tailored to his bones. His hair was neatly cut, not flashy. His face was all angles and restraint, a kind of control that didn't need to show off. The men around him shifted almost imperceptibly. Not fear exactly, something closer to alignment, like their bodies remembered who they served before their minds caught up. Damian's attention moved to Eli first. The boy's spine went even straighter, his expression smoothing into careful neutrality. Whatever softness he'd shown in my cafe was gone, packed away like it had never existed. Watching that happen made my chest ache in a way I couldn't explain. Then Damian's gaze landed on me. It wasn't rude, it wasn't warm. It was thorough, the way a person looks at a locked door to see where it might break. His eyes took in my wet jeans, my cheap shoes, Ruby's blanket, the way I held her, the way I didn't step back. He didn't need to raise his voice to make the air feel heavy. I learned his name, the way you learn something you're supposed to already know, because the people around him reacted to it like a fact. The woman with the clipboard seemed to wait for it to be acknowledged. One of the suited men kept his posture stiff, like he was bracing for my response. Damian Blackwell wasn't just a man with money. He was a man the city had made room for. I'd heard the name before, in the same way you hear the name of a street you're told not to walk down at night. Not in headlines I trusted, not in stories people told loudly, in murmurs, in warnings, in the way someone's voice drops when they say, "Be careful." He offered gratitude, but it didn't feel like thanks. It felt like ownership of the moment, like he was the kind of person whose appreciation came with an invisible receipt. And then the strangest part, his focus sharpened, as if he already had a file on me. In a calm, controlled way, he referenced my little place on Harmon Street, the bookshelves by the window, the fact that I kept the lights on later than I should. He didn't say it like he was impressed. He said it like he'd noticed, like noticing me was an option he'd taken before tonight. My skin prickled. I adjusted Ruby in my arms, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt standing on his driveway. The storm chose that moment to throw another wave of rain sideways. Wind pushed it under the porch roof. Ruby shivered against my neck. Damian's eyes flicked to her, and for the briefest second, something human crossed his face, gone before I could be sure it was real. He guided the situation the way someone guides traffic. No force, no debate, just an expectation that everyone would move where he directed. The door remained open behind him, warmth spilling out like an answer. I understood that I wasn't being asked to come inside. I was being contained. So I stepped forward, boots squeaking on wet stone, and crossed the threshold with Ruby on my hip. Eli disappeared with the clipboard woman almost immediately, glancing back once with that same steady-eyed wariness. Not a goodbye, a check-in, like he wanted to confirm I wasn't leaving him alone with whatever waited upstairs. Inside, the house was quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It felt managed. The floors were polished stone, but not showy. The lighting was soft, warm, deliberate. Expensive art hung on the walls, but then right beside it, a child's drawing sat in a simple frame. Crayon planets, a crooked rocket ship, a stick figure family with an extra tall person at the edge, drawn in careful lines. A lived-in corner, books stacked on a side table, not staged, spines creased like they'd been opened. A blanket folded over the arm of a chair, slightly rumpled, tiny signs that a child lived here, even if the security outside suggested childhood wasn't allowed to be normal. Damian moved with me through the entryway as if the whole space belonged to his orbit, like the air rearranged itself when he passed. A staff member appeared without sound and took my dripping coat before I could decide whether to refuse. Another presence hovered near the doorway, not blocking it, but making it clear I wasn't walking back out without permission. I tried to keep my face calm for Ruby. I brushed wet hair off her forehead, whispered comfort without making it a scene. Because if I acted like I was scared, she'd become scared too. Damian's attention returned to me, and I felt the next part coming before it arrived. The private conversation, the controlled questions, the kind of help that would come with strings. He angled his body slightly toward a hallway that looked quieter, more secluded, and the motion was so smooth it could have been courtesy. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of a negotiation I didn't know how to refuse. Damian led me away from the bright, echoing entryway into a quieter room that swallowed sound the way thick curtains swallow light. The storm became a distant throb behind stone and glass. Somewhere deep in the house, a clock ticked with the confidence of something that had never worried about rent. The space felt like a study, but not the cozy kind I imagined in old movies. Dark wood, clean lines, books arranged with intention, not clutter. A fire burned low in a wide hearth, more for atmosphere than warmth. Everything looked used, but nothing looked touched by chaos. I stood there with wet hair, damp jeans, and boots that had tracked in the city's dirty slush, and I suddenly felt like a stain. Ruby clung to my shoulder, half asleep, her cheek warm against my collarbone. Her small weight kept me anchored. If I let myself spiral, she would feel it, so I focused on practical things. My breathing, her blanket, the way Eli had disappeared upstairs without a fuss, like a kid who knew exactly what was expected. Damian didn't pace. He didn't fidget. He stood still, which somehow made him feel bigger. The house seemed to hold its posture when he was in it. Even the air felt organized. His gratitude came first, but it wasn't the kind that wraps you up and softens you. It landed like a stamp, like my role in this moment had been noted and filed away. Then, without warning, he proved he already knew details that should have belonged only to me. He knew my cafe was more books than coffee. He knew I closed late when I shouldn't. He knew Ruby's name, or at least knew enough to make my blood run cold with the certainty that he'd paid attention before tonight. I told myself it could have come from Eli, from what the boy saw and absorbed in my little place, but the way Damian's attention moved felt older than that, like he'd noticed my existence long before the storm pushed his child to my door. My protective instinct flared hot. The part of me that had learned to survive alone wanted to scoop Ruby up and walk straight back out, no matter how foolish it would look. But I could feel the invisible hands of this place, the security outside, the silent staff inside, the certainty that leaving wasn't as simple as turning a knob. I steadied my voice in my own head and reminded myself of the only rule that mattered: keep Ruby safe. Damian's focus shifted, and I felt the pivot before it fully happened. He wasn't interested in a long explanation about why Eli had been alone. He wasn't offering me a ride home and a polite farewell. He was turning my presence into a solution. He framed it as concern for his son. Eli, he made clear through the way he described him, did not connect with the professionals hired to handle him. Tutors, coaches, all the polished help money can buy. Eli complied, but he didn't open up. He stayed locked behind the same careful mask I'd watched him put back on the moment we crossed the gate. But with me, in my cramped cafe with its wobbly chair legs and chipped mugs, something had shifted. Eli had taken a breath. He had accepted warmth. He had let himself be a child for a few minutes. Damian watched that fact the way a strategist watches a weakness in an opponent's wall. Not to exploit it in a cruel way, but to use it, to get what he wanted. He wanted me to tutor Eli, several afternoons a week, consistent, structured, the kind of commitment that doesn't fit neatly into a struggling business and a single mom schedule, the kind of commitment that comes with strings even when nobody admits it out loud. My first reaction was a hard no rising in my chest, because everything in this house screamed danger dressed up as luxury, because I could feel eyes on me even in this quiet room, as if I were never truly alone, because Eli's drilled instincts didn't come from nowhere, and I didn't want Ruby anywhere near whatever had created them. But then my mind did what it always did. It ran the numbers. My rent notice. The extra $1,200. The way the cafe's profit disappeared into bills before I could even pretend it was mine. The way Ruby needed new shoes, and I'd been hoping the old ones could last one more month. The way I'd been standing behind that counter every day, trying to sell comfort for $6 at a time and calling it a life. Damian's world and mine were so far apart they barely shared oxygen. And yet here we were, connected by a child who had shown up in the rain like a message. I hated the imbalance. I hated that he could ask for something like this and expect it to happen. I hated that my fear came mixed with a very human, very ugly practicality. He could fix my money problem in a sentence. I also couldn't stop seeing Eli's face under my cafe table. Not scared the way most kids get scared. Scared the way someone gets scared when they've learned there are consequences for mistakes. That empathy was the hook. Damian didn't have to tug it. It tugged itself. I didn't give him a clean answer in that moment. Not because I was playing games, but because my pride and my survival were wrestling in my throat. I kept Ruby's head tucked under my chin, kissed her hair once, and made myself hold steady. I told myself I would think. I told myself I would sleep on it. I told myself I would wake up and decide like a normal person. The truth was, I already felt the door closing behind me. A black SUV took me home afterward. Not a question, not a suggestion, just a smooth transfer of responsibility. Ruby slept the entire ride, her breath fogging the window in soft bursts. I stared out at Chicago sliding by, and the city looked different from behind tinted glass. Sharper edges, deeper shadows. Like I'd been living in one version of it, and tonight I'd been shown another. I barely slept. My brain kept circling the same thought. Help is never free when it comes from someone like him. Morning hit with too much brightness. The cafe smelled like yesterday's grounds and fresh bread, familiar enough to make last night feel unreal. I tried to lose myself in routine inventory, wiping tables, greeting the early regulars with a smile that felt glued on. Around noon, the bell above the door rang, and the room seemed to tighten. She walked in like she owned the air. Tall, crisp coat, hair pulled back in a way that didn't allow softness. Her eyes moved fast, taking in the exits, the customers, Ruby's coloring spot at the corner table. She carried a slim folder like it weighed nothing. I knew her the second I saw her, not from a name, from the energy, administrative pressure with sharp edges. Vera Hallow. She didn't wait in line. She didn't scan the menu. She stepped straight to the counter and slid the folder toward me with the kind of finality people use when they're delivering court papers. Inside was a contract, a schedule, and a number that made my stomach flip. 10 yuan. Not for a month, not for a semester. For the arrangement as written, with payments structured in a way that made it clear this wasn't charity. This was purchase. A transaction meant to remove hesitation. My face stayed still because customers were watching and because Ruby was within earshot. But inside, heat rushed up my neck. Anger, shame, relief so sharp it hurt. Then I saw the other document. A non-disclosure agreement. The words were dense, legal, and far too heavy for something as simple as tutoring a child. It wasn't just about protecting a family's privacy. It was about controlling what I could say, what I could share, what I could even imply. It was about building a wall around their life and making me part of the mortar. My hands trembled when I turned the pages. I hated that they were trembling. I hated that I needed the money enough to keep reading. I looked past the paper to Ruby. She was humming softly to herself, coloring a heart in the corner of a flyer, safe for the moment. I thought about the rent notice in my apron pocket. I thought about Eli's guarded eyes and the way they softened when he realized someone had opened a door for him. That was how they corner you, I realized. Not with threats, with needs. Vera watched me like a clock watches time. No impatience, just certainty. I felt my pride rise up one last time, begging me to throw the folder back and say I wasn't for sale. Then the practical part of me spoke louder. Ruby isn't for sale either, but her safety costs money. My roof costs money. Her food costs money. And Eli cost me something else, something harder to name. A sense of responsibility I hadn't agreed to but couldn't shake. I picked up the pen. I hovered for one long breath, feeling the line I was about to cross. Then I signed, because my daughter needed stability, and because a frightened boy had looked at me like hope was a thing adults could still provide. And the second my name hit that paper, I knew I'd stepped into Damian Blackwell's orbit for real. By the first Monday, the routine had already been decided for me. A black SUV collected me and Ruby at 2:30 p.m., carried us through clean streets, and delivered us to the same iron gate that opened without asking. Inside, the house stayed quiet, even when rain tapped the windows. Noah, the head of security, checked names and bags with polite eyes that never softened. Eli waited in a bright study lined with shelves, a whiteboard, and more books than my cafe could ever afford. I told myself this was just tutoring. I didn't believe it. Not even once. Eli worked like he was being graded on silence. He answered questions with careful pauses, watching my face more than the page, as if one wrong reaction could turn warmth into punishment. The supplies were unreal. Glossy workbooks, a tablet loaded with programs, a telescope diagram pinned beside his desk. He kept a small box of rocks in a drawer, each labeled in neat handwriting, and when he forgot to be guarded, his fingers traced them like worry stones. Ruby sat on the rug with crayons, offering him a purple one without fuss. He accepted it like a treaty. Quietly. The first time Damian appeared, I didn't hear footsteps. I only felt the room tighten. Eli's shoulders lifted, his voice smoothing into something formal, his pencil strokes perfect. He stopped chewing his lip, stopped fidgeting, stopped being 7. Damian stood in the doorway like he belonged to the shadows and the light at the same time, hands clasped, expression unreadable. I kept teaching, but my heart pounded with anger that surprised me. A child shouldn't have to perform to earn safety. When Damian left, Eli exhaled and asked for the same chapter again, his favorite, about stars finding their way home. By Friday, the pattern repeated. I arrived. Noah nodded. A guard lingered by the hall as if tutoring needed muscle. Eli tested me in small ways. He slipped a hard word into a sentence and waited to see if I laughed. He showed me a sketch of a spiral staircase and watched for pity. He asked what I would do if someone took Ruby's backpack. I answered honestly, sometimes too honestly, and his eyes softened for a breath. He loved architecture, drew houses with hidden rooms and thick doors. I told myself it was imagination, then the drawings had exits. One afternoon, Ruby refused the quiet playroom and followed me into the corridor, dragging her blanket like a cape. I scooped her up before she could wander, and that's when Damian came around the corner. He paused, not surprised, just measuring. His gaze went to Ruby's damp curls, to the way she fit against my chest, then back to me with a question he didn't ask out loud. I felt seen, in a way that wasn't gentle. It was protection and possession tangled together. He brushed past, close enough for me to catch wood smoke, and my nerves lit up anyway. I saw the protocol by accident. Eli grabbed a workbook, and the folder behind it slid out onto the rug. A laminated checklist stared up at me. Routes, colors, times, and a line about Ruby staying with me, while Noah secured Eli. A drill chart sat beneath it, boxes already checked, like fire drills but colder. A coded phrase was printed at the top, a sentence meant to prove you belonged. My eyes followed the arrows to a bookshelf with one spine slightly taller. I pressed it. The shelf shifted a fraction, like a door pretending to be furniture still. After that, I couldn't unsee the house. The cameras weren't decor, the quiet guards weren't just staff, and Eli's restraint wasn't personality. It was practice. During lessons, I started slipping in small choices, letting him pick the book, letting him stand to read, letting him laugh at Ruby's silly drawings without looking over his shoulder first. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes Damian appeared, and Eli snapped back into perfect posture so fast it made my teeth ache. Damian didn't scold. He didn't praise. He only watched, and that watching was its own kind of command. I found hating it for him. Near the end of the 3rd week, the rhythm cracked. Mid-lesson, Noah's radio hissed, and a guard appeared with urgency held tight behind his eyes. He spoke low to Damian in the hall, words I couldn't catch, but the air changed instantly. Damian's jaw set. Eli noticed and went still, hands flat on the desk like he was bracing. The session ended without explanation, and Noah escorted Ruby and me out a different corridor. Outside, more SUVs waited, engines running. On the ride home, Ruby hummed, and I stared at my cafe keys, sure the outside world had found me. The next morning I opened my cafe like nothing had changed, but my senses refused to reset. Every glance felt like counting. Every car that idled long outside made my chest tighten. I stocked muffins, wiped tables, and kept Ruby close, pretending the world was still just bills and burnt espresso. Yet my mind replayed the checklist, the shelf door, the way Eli's body knew how to freeze. Preparedness wasn't a side detail in his life. It was the foundation. I caught myself listening for the bell above my door the way he listened for engines. By closing, I felt watched. That night I closed early. Ruby's backpack bumped my knee as I carried her upstairs, and I kept picturing Eli's drawings with exits. I told myself to stop borrowing trouble. Still, I checked the locks twice. The street was empty, slick with rain, and neon made puddles glow. When I turned off the last light, I saw a thin shape on the floor just inside the door, like it had been pushed through the gap. Not a flyer, not a bill, an unmarked envelope. I didn't pick it up. I stood there, keys in my fist, listening to it breathe. The next day, I tried to live like 2 worlds could stay separated. I opened the cafe at 7 a.m. the way I always did, palms smelling like sanitizer and coffee grounds. I flipped chairs down, counted the drawer, wiped yesterday's fingerprints off the glass pastry case. I listened to the familiar noises, my ancient fridge clicking on, the espresso machine groaning awake, the bell over the door giving its little jingle every time a regular came in for their usual. But inside my head, the other world kept replaying. Eli's perfect posture, Damian's silent watching, the laminated checklist that had slid onto the rug like a warning I wasn't meant to read, the fake bookshelf seam I couldn't unsee. Ruby sat at her corner table with cereal in a paper cup, humming while she colored a sun with a face. I kept glancing at her like I could memorize her outline, as if love could turn into armor if I stared hard enough. By late afternoon, after tutoring and the ride home and the heavy quiet that always followed being in that house, I came back to the cafe to reset. That's what I called it, resetting like wiping counters could wipe my nerves clean. I told myself I was safe here. I told myself the city was loud and messy and normal, and no one had any reason to look at me twice. The first thing I noticed was the cold, not the weather. The kind of cold that slips under a door even when the heat is on. I stepped inside and felt it brush my ankles. A thin draft that didn't belong. The bell didn't ring. The door hadn't been opened the normal way. Then I saw it. An envelope, unmarked, thin and cream-colored, lying just inside the frame like someone had fed it through the gap with careful fingers. It sat on my worn tile floor like a dropped feather, innocent-looking, and my stomach turned as if I'd swallowed a stone. For a second, I just stood there with my keys in my hand, listening to the building settle. Ruby's boots scuffed behind me. She started to ask something in that soft kid voice, the one that still believed adults had answers. I shifted my body so she couldn't see the envelope clearly. I told her, with a steadiness that cost me, to go wash her hands and pick a book upstairs. I made it sound like routine, like nothing was wrong, like I wasn't about to crack. Ruby nodded and climbed the steps without arguing, because she's used to my rules, and that broke my heart a little. Kids shouldn't have to be that easy. When she was out of sight, I crouched and picked up the envelope. The paper edge was sharp, clean, like it had been cut by someone who liked precision. My fingers shook anyway. I carried it behind the counter, where customers couldn't see through the front window, and I opened it with a butter knife so I didn't tear anything by accident. 2 items slid out. The first was a photo, not a printed from a store kind of photo. A crisp shot, taken from across the street, of my cafe door and the striped awning, rain streaking the glass. It was recent. The reflection in the window showed the yellow glow of my open sign, and my own silhouette behind the counter, head bent, hair in a messy bun, exactly the way I'd looked that morning. Proof I'd been watched. The second item made my vision blur. A small piece of paper torn from a notebook, the kind Ruby uses for doodling. On it was a simple drawing, a heart, a stick figure with curly hair, another stick figure with a long ponytail. Ruby's style, her little shaky lines. In the corner, she'd colored a tiny ribbon blue. Ruby's hair ribbon, the one she'd worn to school yesterday. My mouth went dry. My hands went numb. I pressed the paper flat on the counter as if holding it down could stop what it meant. Whoever had slipped this under my door wasn't guessing. They weren't fishing for information. They already had it. A third thing fell out, almost as an afterthought, a strip of paper with a time written on it. 3:15 p.m. Ruby's school pickup time. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat there behind the counter, breathing shallowly, feeling my heart thud against my ribs like it was trying to break out and run ahead of me. Anger hit first. Hot, fast, irrational anger at whoever thought my child was a chess piece. At Damian's world for leaking into mine. At myself for signing that contract. For believing I could keep the danger contained inside a gated property. Then fear came behind it, colder and heavier. Because fear, when you're a mom, isn't about you. It's about imagining someone else's hands near your kid. I gathered the papers quickly and slid them into the register drawer, like hiding them could erase them. My fingers fumbled the key. I kept glancing toward the stairs, listening for Ruby's footsteps, forcing my face back into something normal in case she came down. I thought about calling the police. The idea rose like a lifeline. Then reality answered. What would I even say? Someone left a drawing under my door? Someone wrote a time on a scrap of paper? In my neighborhood, cops barely showed up for broken windows. And if they did show up, what then? A report. A shrug. Maybe a bored lecture about locking my doors. Meanwhile, the person who left the message would learn I'd gone official, and Ruby's name would become a detail in a system that couldn't keep her safe. I imagined the envelope sender watching my reaction the way Damian watched me tutor, measuring, adjusting. I couldn't risk being dismissed. I couldn't risk making noise that painted a target on Ruby's back. so I did the thing the contract had trained me to do. I pulled out the card Vera had left, minimal, silver embossed number. No name, like the person on the other end didn't need one. My hands shook so badly I had to set the phone on the counter to tap it. I left a message without saying too much, because even the air felt like it could be listening. I described the envelope, the photo, the time, the ribbon. I kept my voice low and controlled, the way I'd watched Eli control his. Then I hung up and locked the cafe door. I checked the front window. The street looked normal. Wet pavement, a bus hissing at the stop, a couple walking fast under a shared umbrella. That normality felt like a cruel joke. I went upstairs and found Ruby with a book open on her lap, swinging her feet. I smiled at her, because I had to. I told her we were going to have an early dinner somewhere else. I made it sound like a treat. My throat burned with the effort. I packed her backpack with a speed that made my hands clumsy. I grabbed her coat, her favorite stuffed animal, the hairbrush she always wants even when she doesn't use it. My mind ran a protective checklist, like I'd become the thing I hated, a mother training her child for danger. Less than 10 minutes after my voicemail, headlights swept across the cafe window. A black SUV. It pulled up smooth and quiet, idling at the curb like it belonged there. My lungs tightened. Part of me felt relief help arriving. Another part felt sick, because help in this world didn't come with choices. 2 men stepped out, both in dark coats, both moving with the kind of calm that makes you feel like you're the only one panicking. They didn't look around like tourists. They looked around like professionals. One stayed near the door. The other came inside without waiting for me to unlock it, because somehow it was already unlocked. I realized with a shameful flush that I'd probably forgotten to turn the deadbolt after taking Ruby upstairs. My hands curled into fists. In my own cafe, I'd made a mistake that could have cost everything. The men didn't raise their voices. They didn't threaten. They didn't need to. Their presence was the pressure. They made it clear through their stillness, through the way their eyes checked the room, through the way they looked past me as if measuring distance to the stairs that Damian wanted me immediately. Not tomorrow. Not later. Now. My cheeks burned with humiliation. I hated feeling moved around like an object. I hated that my fear for Ruby made me cooperate. I flipped the sign to closed with fingers that felt thick and slow. I didn't explain myself to the empty room. I couldn't. I locked the register and turned off half the lights, because some part of me still clung to routine like a prayer. Ruby came down the stairs, rubbing her eyes, clutching her stuffed animal. She looked from me to the men, and her small face tightened with uncertainty. I pulled her close and kissed her forehead, whispering comfort into her hair without making it a conversation. I kept my voice soft. I kept my arms firm. I made my body a wall. The men escorted us out as if escorting was kindness. Outside, the air smelled like rain and exhaust. The street felt suddenly too open, too many places for eyes to hide. I buckled Ruby into the back seat myself, hands steady by force, and slid in beside her so she wouldn't be alone. The door shut with a heavy, final sound. As we pulled away, I looked back at my cafe. The closed sign swung slightly in the window. The striped awning dripped rain. It looked small, vulnerable, like my whole old life had been made of paper, and someone had just set a match near the edge. The SUV moved fast through Chicago, and the city blurred behind tinted glass. Ruby leaned against me, trusting, and I held her tighter, bracing for what waited at the gates, because I understood it now. In the deepest part of my bones, safe wasn't a place. Safe was whoever decided whether you got to go home, and Damian Blackwell had just summoned me like I belonged to him. The SUV felt like a moving closet. Tinted windows turned Chicago into a smear of wet lights and shadows, and the silence inside was so measured it made my breathing feel too loud. Ruby pressed against my side, her small weight warm through her coat, her fingers curled into my sleeve the way they did when she sensed I was holding something back. I wrapped one arm around her and kept the other hand flat on my knee so it wouldn't tremble where she could see it. I watched reflections instead of streets. I watched for headlights that held too long behind us, for turns that matched ours, for any sign the threat had followed us into motion. The suited men in the front didn't talk. Their stillness wasn't comforting. It was procedural, like I'd been moved from one box to another, labeled and transported. Ruby yawned and tried to settle her head on my shoulder. I let her. I told myself that if I could keep my heartbeat steady, she would believe everything was fine. That's the trick of motherhood in a crisis. You act calm until your child borrows your calm, even when you don't feel any inside you. When the gates appeared, opening before we fully stopped, My stomach tightened the way it had the first night. But worse now because I understood the cost of being recognized. The estate didn't look like a home tonight. It looked like a machine waking up. More vehicles lined the drive. More men stood under the lights. Radios hissed softly. The air had that tight edge of urgency, like everyone was moving around a center of gravity that had shifted. When we were guided inside, it wasn't toward the warmer, lived-in corners I'd noticed before. It was toward a deeper room that felt built for control. Dark wood, clean surfaces, lights arranged so nobody could hide in them. I saw Damian before he saw me. He was surrounded by motion that didn't touch him. Men leaned in with low-voiced updates. Phones buzzed and were silenced quickly. Noah moved like a hinge in the room, opening paths, closing gaps. And Damian stood at the center with his attention fixed on something invisible, the way a storm fixes itself on the warmest water. When his eyes landed on me, it felt like a door shutting. Not anger, not welcome. Assessment. Calculation. A fast scan that took in Ruby's face, my clenched jaw, the way my shoulders were squared like I was bracing for impact. I remembered the envelope's sharp edge. The photo. Ruby's ribbon drawn in shaky crayon. My throat tightened as I reached into my bag and pulled out what I'd brought. I hadn't dared leave it at the cafe. I hadn't dared keep it too long either, like the paper itself was contaminated. I placed it where he could see it, and stepped back instinctively, Ruby's hand in mine. Damian didn't react the way most people would. There was no visible shock, no wide eyes, no curse. He looked at the photo like it confirmed something he'd already suspected. And then I watched something in him harden not into rage, but into focus so sharp it felt dangerous to stand near. The room shifted with him. One man stopped mid-sentence. Another took a step back. Noah's posture tightened. That was when I understood how power works here. Not through noise, through the way everyone else adjusts. Damian's explanation came in the same controlled way everything else in his world arrived. Stripped of emotion, shaped like strategy. He made it clear without telling me details I didn't want that this wasn't random. Someone was testing him. Someone was looking for leverage. Someone had decided I was soft enough to press. He gave the name like a weight dropped on the table. The Crow Syndicate. I'd never heard it spoken directly before, but the way the men around him went still told me it mattered. A rival force. A group that didn't need to burn down a building to be terrifying. The message under my door was its own kind of violence, intimate, invasive, designed to make me afraid of my own routine. Damian's gaze stayed on Ruby for a brief beat, and I felt my anger flare up, protective and hot. I wanted to snatch her behind me, as if my body could block his world from touching her. But Ruby squeezed my hand and looked up at me with sleepy confusion, and the fury shifted into something heavier. Responsibility. I tried to speak with my spine instead of my fear. I tried to insist I had a life to return to, that my cafe wasn't a pawn, that Ruby had school, that I couldn't just disappear because someone in his universe decided to make a point. The words formed in my mind like a protest. Damian dismantled them before they could become a plan. He didn't mock me. He didn't threaten me. He did something worse. He laid out reality with cold efficiency. He made it clear my cafe was already compromised, my routines already mapped, and any official attention I drew would only widen the circle around Ruby. He framed it as protection, but it also sounded like a verdict, the kind delivered by someone who didn't ask permission because permission was a luxury for people outside his orbit. Then came the reversal that knocked the air out of my lungs. Eli wasn't here. I looked toward the hallway that usually led to the study space, half expecting to see him appear with a book under his arm, trying to pretend he wasn't worried. But the corridors remained empty, and when Damian made it clear Eli had already been moved quietly, quickly, to a secure location, my chest tightened with a strange grief I didn't have time to understand. I hadn't realized how much I'd been bracing myself around Eli until the thought of him being gone made me feel unsteady. And then Damian admitted the part he didn't seem to enjoy saying. Eli had asked for me, not in a casual way, not as a preference, as a need. As if, in the middle of being relocated like cargo, Eli had reached for the one person who had made him feel like a child for 5 minutes. My anger turned sideways, because it wasn't just that Ruby and I were in danger now. It was that I mattered in a way I hadn't consented to. I wasn't just a tutor anymore. I was a stabilizing point for a child whose life was built on drills and exits. I looked down at Ruby. Her thumb had drifted into her mouth, a sleepy habit she'd almost outgrown. She watched the room with quiet curiosity, trusting me to interpret what was happening. My heart broke a little, because I couldn't keep her in the dark forever, but I also couldn't hand her the fear. Damian made the decision out loud in the only language this house seemed to respect. Action. We were leaving Chicago. Immediately. A secure safe house. Remote. Controlled. Somewhere the Crow Syndicate couldn't reach easily. Somewhere Eli already was. I protested anyway. Because what else does a person do when their life is being folded into someone else's plan? I thought of my cafe, my keys, my inventory, my rent notice, the little corner Ruby colored in every morning. I thought of the customers who would show up and find the sign flipped and wonder if I'd finally lost the fight. Damian's response didn't soften, but I caught a flicker of something when his gaze returned to Ruby. Not warmth exactly, recognition maybe. A brief understanding that Ruby's safety wasn't a line item. She was a whole human being. That flicker made the trap feel even tighter, because if he cared even a little, it meant he would do whatever he thought was necessary. And his definition of necessary didn't include my comfort. Noah appeared with instructions that were delivered like a checklist. What to pack, what to leave, how long we had. Vera moved through the edge of the room with a phone pressed to her ear, arranging logistics with calm speed. A staff member brought Ruby a cup with warm cocoa, and Ruby accepted it with polite confusion, looking to me for confirmation it was safe. I nodded. I hated that I had to. I was given a window of time that wasn't really a window, more like a countdown. I followed a staff member to a guest room, where my bags waited open like mouths. I packed Ruby's pajamas, her toothbrush, her favorite sweater, the stuffed animal she couldn't sleep without. My hands moved fast while my mind lagged behind, still stuck on the idea that my life was being reduced to what fit into fabric and zippers. I added my cafe keys anyway, even though I didn't know why. Maybe because holding them made me feel like I hadn't fully surrendered. Downstairs, engines started. Through the window I saw the convoy form. Multiple black SUVs lined up like a sentence you couldn't interrupt. Rain had stopped, but the air outside looked colder than before, washed clean and ready for whatever came next. Ruby tugged my sleeve and asked with her eyes where we were going. I knelt, smoothed her hair, and promised her we were going somewhere safe, even though safe had become a word that tasted unfamiliar in my mouth. When Noah guided us toward the door, my stomach dropped so hard it felt like falling. Because the city I knew, my cafe, my apartment upstairs, the sidewalk where Ruby skipped was now behind me, and the only path forward was into Damian Blackwell's protection, or his captivity. The SUV door opened, and I climbed in with Ruby held close, watching the estate lights recede as the convoy rolled out into the night. We left Chicago the way you leave a burning room quietly, quickly, with your lungs still full of smoke you can't explain to anyone else. Ruby fell asleep against me before we even hit the highway. Her stuffed animal was tucked under her chin, her breath warm on my collarbone. I kept one hand on her back like an anchor, the other wrapped around the strap of the bag that held our whole life. Pajamas, a spare sweatshirt, a toothbrush, my cafe keys that felt ridiculous and necessary at the same time. Every few minutes I checked Ruby's face for any sign she'd woken into fear. I kept my own expression steady, because if she saw panic, she would learn panic. Outside the tinted windows, the city glow thinned out, and the streets became longer, darker ribbons. The convoy moved like one body. Headlights cut clean tunnels through mist. Occasionally, low radio chatter cracked through the silence from the front seats' short bursts, coded by tone more than words. I didn't understand it, but I understood the feeling. Constant scanning, constant measurement, an endless readiness for something that might not even arrive. As the hours stretched, the landscape changed. The flat city gave way to wider shoulders of road, then to rolling hills. The highway signs became fewer. The lights from gas stations and late-night diners started to feel like islands, small and far apart, and I found myself watching them with a weird homesickness. Not for Chicago's danger, but for its normal noise. For the illusion that you could disappear in crowds. At some point after midnight, the route turned onto narrower roads that climbed and curved. Trees pressed in on both sides, tall and black, their branches slick with moisture that caught the headlights in quick flashes. The air looked colder here. Even the darkness felt cleaner, as if the city's grime couldn't reach this high. I kept thinking about my cafe. The sign, the envelope, the feeling of my life being handled like paperwork. I tried not to. I tried to stay present with Ruby's breathing, with the steady motion of the car, with the small ache in my arms that meant she was safe in them right now. When the safe house finally appeared, it didn't look like what my fear had been imagining. It wasn't a cabin with a porch light and a creaky door. It was a modern fortress disguised as a home glass and stone tucked into the trees like it had grown there on purpose. Warm light spilled from wide windows, soft and inviting. But the angles of the structure were too controlled. The sightlines were too clean. The landscaping wasn't decorative. It was strategic. Nothing tall enough to hide behind. No clutter near entrances. Even the driveway felt designed to funnel you exactly where someone wanted you. Cameras were there, but subtle dark lenses tucked into eaves, hidden in the corners of stone pillars. The doors looked beautiful, heavy wood framed in steel, the kind of door that could stop weather and questions alike. The vehicles rolled to a stop in a practiced pattern. People moved quickly, quietly, checking perimeter points with flashlights angled low. Noah's silhouette passed through the front entry like he was inspecting the air itself. I stepped out with Ruby still asleep and felt the mountain cold bite my cheeks. It smelled like pine and wet earth. For 1 second, it almost felt peaceful. Then I saw the way the guards held their shoulders, the way their eyes moved even when their faces stayed blank, and the word peace turned into something else. Pause. Inside, the warmth hit like a sigh I didn't know I'd been holding. The floors were stone, but softer underfoot than Damian's Chicago estate. The lighting was golden and low. A fire glowed behind glass in a wide living room that opened onto windows facing nothing but trees. The world outside was dark and enormous, and it made the interior feel like a ship drifting in a black ocean. I hadn't even fully stepped in when Eli appeared. He was dressed neatly, like always, but the moment his eyes landed on me, the mask slipped. Not dramatically, not like a movie. Just in the smallest way, his shoulders dropped, his mouth trembled, and he moved toward me with a speed that didn't match his usual careful control. He pressed into my side with the kind of relief kids don't like to admit they need. His arms wrapped around me like he was checking that I was real. I felt my own throat tighten. I had been telling myself I was just his tutor, that I was replaceable, that this wasn't my responsibility. His grip told the truth. Ruby stirred at the movement. She blinked up at him, then at me, confused but curious. I shifted her so she could see his face. Eli's eyes flicked to her, and something softened further, like Ruby's presence gave him permission to be human. Ruby reached out sleepily and patted his sleeve in the way she does when she wants to comfort but doesn't know how to label it. Eli stared at her hand for a beat, then leaned closer, accepting it. That small gesture did something to the room. It pulled the air back toward normal, toward children and warmth, away from radios and gates. For the next few days, time became strange. Morning light poured through the mountain windows in pale sheets, and for a few hours each day, we pretended we were just people in a house. Eli and I did lessons at a long wooden table where you could see the trees sway outside. He worked quickly, eyes bright when the topic was astronomy. He sketched constellations in the margins of his workbook, careful lines that looked like he was building maps for escape and wonder at the same time. He showed Ruby a small rock collection he'd brought with him, each stone wrapped in tissue like it was valuable. Ruby contributed a smooth pebble she'd found in her coat pocket, presenting it like a gift. Eli accepted it with solemn gratitude, then tucked it into his box like it belonged there. Meals were simple and too quiet. Soup, toast, fruit. Ruby talked more than the adults, filling space with small stories about school and books, about the time she spilled milk on my favorite sweater. Eli listened like he was learning what normal sounded like. Damian, meanwhile, was present the way a storm is present even when it hasn't arrived. He had a secured office down a hall that felt subtly restricted, doors that looked ordinary but closed too softly, walls that absorbed sound. He went in and out at odd hours. When he emerged, the shadows under his eyes were darker, and his posture was even more controlled. Like exhaustion was something he refused to let anyone witness. Sometimes I caught him watching from a distance, not in the doorway this time, but from the far end of a hallway or through a glass partition. Eli still reacted, not as sharply as in Chicago, but enough. His shoulders would lift, his voice would smooth, his laughter would cut short like he'd remembered a rule. Each time it happened, my anger rose again, quiet and sharp. A child shouldn't have to do that. A child shouldn't have to be two versions of himself depending on who was watching. One afternoon, while Eli was upstairs changing out of his lesson clothes, Ruby wanted a book. I followed her into a small reading nook off the living room, a space that looked genuinely lived in. A worn sofa, a lamp with a warm shade, a low shelf full of children's stories. Ruby's fingers trailed along the spines until she chose one with a faded cover. She handed it to me with the solemnity only kids can manage. When I opened it, something slipped out and fluttered into my lap. A note. Not printed. Handwritten. In neat, careful script. The ink was slightly faded as if it had been touched many times. The words weren't a message for me. They were a message for a child. Little reminders tucked into the margins. Encouragement. Gentle corrections. a tiny drawing of a star beside a tricky page. There was even a soft joke in the corner, the kind meant to make a child smile mid-sentence. I turned another page and found more. Small notes, consistent handwriting, a love woven quietly into paper. My chest tightened, with a realization that made the fortress feel suddenly less abstract. Eli's mother, the woman who wasn't here. The tenderness in those notes didn't match the hardness of the world surrounding them, and yet it existed, preserved, protected, not as a showpiece, but as something private that had survived. I sat there with the book open on my knees, Ruby leaning against my shoulder, and I felt my view of Damian shift in a way I didn't fully trust. Grief had lived here, love had lived here, which meant the man who ran this fortress wasn't built only from cold decisions. He had once been someone who let a child's mother leave her handwriting in the margins and keep it there. It didn't excuse anything, but it made the danger feel more complicated, more human, more terrifying in a way, because it meant even love didn't keep people safe. That evening, the fake calm started to crack. I noticed it in the details first. The way Noah did an extra perimeter check before dinner, the way a guard paused at a window longer than usual, the way the radios hissed a little more frequently. Damian passed through the living room with his phone pressed to his ear, voice low enough that I only caught fragments distance, timing. Nothing confirmed. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the trees. Later, when the house lights dimmed and the mountain outside turned into one solid dark shape, I saw headlights sweep the tree line in a slow, deliberate pattern, not searching wildly, checking, confirming. I tucked Ruby into bed with a softness I had to force. I kissed her forehead and told her tomorrow would be better, even though I didn't know what tomorrow would be. When I turned off her lamp, I stood still in the hallway for a moment, listening. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't mean peace. The kind of quiet that means everyone is waiting for the first alarm to break it. The evening started the way a desperate person starts pretending. I warmed water for tea and wrapped Ruby in a blanket that smelled like laundry soap and a little like her hair. Eli sat on the floor near the fire with his knees pulled in, trying to look casual, trying to look like a kid on a normal night in a normal house. He kept glancing at the windows anyway, at the dark tree line that pressed close like a crowd. I chose a book on purpose, the one Ruby liked because it had gentle pictures and predictable chapters, the one I had found in the reading nook with those careful handwritten notes tucked into the margins. I told myself the notes were a comfort, proof that love had lived here before danger did. I wanted the kids to borrow that feeling for a while. Ruby leaned into my side. Eli sat close enough that his shoulder almost touched mine. For a few minutes, the safe house really did look like what it wanted to look like. Warm light, quiet rooms, mountains outside holding the wind. Then the house reminded me what it was built for. The first alarm didn't sound like panic. It sounded like a decision. A sharp tone sliced through the hallway, and at the same time the lighting shifted, red strips blooming along the baseboards and corners like a warning bleeding into the walls. The fire's glow suddenly looked weak, almost decorative. Footsteps appeared from nowhere. Radios hissed with clipped bursts. The air filled with motion so fast my mind lagged behind it. Ruby startled upright, eyes wide. Eli didn't jump the way most kids would. He went still. Too still. His chin lifted, shoulders squaring, his face smoothing into that trained calm that always made my chest ache. Damian moved through the room like he'd been waiting behind a curtain. A second ago he hadn't been there. Now he was, and everything adjusted around him. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to explain. His body language was enough, direct, controlled, already halfway into whatever plan had been written for this moment long before I arrived. Noah appeared at his shoulder. A guard moved to the windows, another to a panel near the door. I caught flashes of hands pointing, heads turning, quick nods. The safe house became a machine, and I realized the cozy fire and the children's books had always been part of that machine too. Softness placed strategically, like padding around a cage. Damian's attention landed on me, then on Ruby, then on Eli, in that exact order, and I knew what was coming before it happened. We were being moved, not asked, not suggested, directed. I scooped Ruby up, blanket and all, because her legs had gone stiff with fear. I reached for Eli with my free hand. He didn't need to be pulled. He was already stepping into place beside me, breathing controlled, eyes scanning corners and ceilings like he was counting exits. We didn't go down the main hall. Noah guided us through a side corridor that looked ordinary until a section of wall shifted. A door disguised as paneling opened into a narrow passage. The air in there was cooler, smelling faintly of concrete and metal. The sound of the alarms was muffled instantly, as if the house had swallowed its own panic. Ruby's fingers dug into my shoulder. I smoothed her hair and kept my breathing slow on purpose, letting her feel my steadiness. My heart was slamming anyway. I could feel it in my wrists, in my throat, in the way my knees wanted to lock. Eli moved like he'd done this before. Not with confidence, with familiarity. He kept his steps measured and quiet. His eyes flicked to the floor, the corners, the seam where wall met ceiling, as if checking boxes on an invisible list. Every time the passage turned, he adjusted his body so he was slightly between Ruby and the open space ahead. That protective instinct in a 7-year-old made me furious. It also made me grateful, which was an ugly feeling to carry. Behind us, somewhere deeper in the house, I felt vibrations through the walls. A dull thud, another, not close enough to see but close enough to feel in the soles of my feet. Voices rose and cut off. A radio crackled. The red light followed us, faint strips embedded along the passage like veins. We reached a door that looked like a storage closet until Noah typed a code and pressed his palm to a hidden sensor. The door unlocked with a heavy click that sounded final. Inside was a concrete room disguised by small comforts. Shelves lined one wall, packed with water, sealed food, a first aid kit, spare blankets. A battery-powered lantern sat ready. A small bathroom door was tucked into the corner. Along the opposite wall were books, children's books, worn spines, familiar titles, and a basket of quiet toys like someone had thought about what fear does to kids and tried to plan around it. Eli went straight to a panel on the wall and checked a light that blinked from red to steady amber. His hands moved with precision, but when he reached for the shelf, I saw the tremor in his fingers. He caught it, curled his hand into a fist, and put the fist behind his back like he could hide shaking from the room itself. Ruby clung to me, eyes darting. I crouched with her and pressed my forehead to hers, holding that small contact that always brings her back to me. I guided her breathing with my own slow in, slow out. I felt her copy me, the way she always does when she's scared, but determined to be brave. Time changed in that room. Seconds stretched thin. Minutes felt thick and heavy. The sounds outside became the whole world. Distant impacts that made the air tremble, muffled footsteps rushing overhead. The occasional sharp burst of radio chatter filtered through walls designed to keep us alive. Eli sat rigid beside Ruby, his back too straight, his expression too composed. He kept swallowing like his throat hurt. He kept his gaze forward as if he'd learned that looking around too much was a kind of weakness. I couldn't let them sit inside their own thoughts. So I reached for the book. Not just any book. The one from earlier, the one with the handwriting that had made my chest tighten in the reading nook. I held it in my lap, my fingers steadying on the cover, and I opened to the first page. The margin notes were there, soft and neat, like a voice that had once leaned close and whispered encouragement. A small star drawn beside a tricky paragraph. A gentle reminder to take a breath. A tiny joke at the corner of a page, the kind meant for a child who needed a reason to smile mid-story. Eli's eyes snapped to the book. For a second, the mask cracked. Not fully. Just enough for me to see the child underneath, the one who missed someone he didn't talk about. Ruby scooted closer, resting her hand on the edge of the page as if touching paper could hold the room together. I started reading out loud, but I didn't frame it like a performance. I made it a lifeline. My voice became the rhythm we could all hold on to. I kept it warm, steady, ordinary. I read the same way I read at home when Ruby had nightmares, slow enough to soothe, clear enough to keep their minds from racing ahead into worst-case images. Outside, the house shook again. A longer vibration this time, like something heavy had hit somewhere far but not far enough. Ruby flinched. Eli's jaw tightened. I didn't stop reading. I let my voice stay calm, even when my stomach clenched. I turned a page and found a longer note in the margin. The handwriting dipped slightly, like the pen had paused with emotion. It wasn't a secret message. It was a mother's quiet instruction to her child, telling him he was brave even when he felt small, telling him stories were safe places you could carry inside you. My throat tightened. I kept reading anyway, because the room needed my steadiness more than I needed my tears. Minutes passed, then more minutes. The lantern hummed softly. The air smelled like concrete and paper, and the faint sweetness of Ruby's shampoo. Eli's breathing stayed controlled, but his shoulder had slowly inched closer to mine, like he was letting himself lean on someone without admitting it. The sounds outside shifted, less rushing, more quiet between bursts. The impacts became farther apart. The radios, once constant, turned into occasional, clipped updates. I counted the pauses without meaning to. I listened for a new pattern. Then a small light on the wall panel blinked, amber to green. Eli stared at it as if he didn't trust it. Ruby looked at me, searching my face for the right reaction. A moment later, the communication speaker crackled, and Damian's voice came through low, controlled, stripped of detail, carrying the only thing that mattered. The immediate danger had passed, and it was safe to come out. I didn't move right away. I closed the book gently and held it to my chest for a second, like the notes inside were a fragile promise. I kissed Ruby's forehead and told her with my eyes and my steady breath that we were okay. I reached for Eli's hand without making it a big moment. He hesitated, then let his fingers rest against mine. When the heavy door unlocked, the sound echoed like a final chapter ending. We stood together, bracing ourselves to step out of the concrete box and into whatever the house looked like now, into whatever Damian looked like now. Knowing the all clear didn't mean untouched. It only meant we were about to see the cost. The panic room door released with a heavy, reluctant sound, like the house didn't want to show us what it looked like when it stopped pretending. Cold air met my face first, then the smell sharp, metallic in the way alarms feel even after they're silent, mixed with smoke that wasn't thick enough to choke but strong enough to announce itself. The hallway lights had returned to their normal warm tones, but the warmth didn't match the scene. It felt pasted on. We stepped out into a space that had been rearranged by force and urgency. A side table lay on its side like someone had pushed it to clear a path. A lamp was broken, its shade bent, its cord trailing across the floor like a snapped string. One wide window near the living room had spiderweb cracks that caught the light in thin, glittering lines. Someone had already started cleaning. I could tell by the towels stacked in a neat pile, and the way a staff member moved quickly with a dustpan, eyes down, expression blank. Ruby stayed tucked against me, her blanket dragging behind like a cape she couldn't carry. She blinked hard, trying to understand why the cozy room from earlier looked wrong now. I smoothed her hair and kept my voice low and steady in the way I use when she's on the edge of tears, letting her hear calm even if my own body still felt like it was buzzing. Eli slipped past me the second he saw the main hall. He moved fast, then stopped too suddenly, like he'd hit an invisible wall. Damian stood near the center of the room where the cleanup energy swirled around him. His suit jacket was gone. One sleeve of his shirt was torn at the cuff, darkened in a way that made my stomach drop, and a strip of cloth had been wrapped around his forearm with clinical tightness. Not dramatic, not messy, just enough to say he'd been hurt and had refused to make it anyone else's problem. His face was composed, but exhaustion sat under his eyes like shadow that had finally been allowed to exist. Eli's brave mask flickered. He took one step closer, then his gaze caught on Damian's arm and he froze, jaw tight, shoulders lifting into that familiar, perfect posture. The child in him wanted to run. The trained part wanted to stand still and behave correctly. I watched him swallow emotion like it was a rule. Damian knelt slightly, lowering himself into Eli's line of sight, making his presence feel less like a wall and more like a shelter. He moved his uninjured hand with quiet care, the kind of tenderness that didn't perform for anyone. In the middle of a scarred room, surrounded by men who carried themselves like weapons, Damian's focus narrowed to his son's face as if nothing else existed. That contrast hit me hard. I had been afraid of Damian since the night I met him, afraid of what his world demanded and what it could do to anyone standing too close. But watching him steady Eli without fuss, I felt something I didn't want to feel. Relief. The dangerous kind. The kind that makes you stop fighting the tide for one breath because you're tired and someone else is holding the line. A guard approached Damian with a quick update I couldn't hear. Damian listened with that same still attention and gave a small nod that sent the room moving again. Radios softened, footsteps redistributed. The frantic edge of emergency began to shift into a colder, more organized aftermath. I caught fragments without meaning to, enough to understand the Crow Syndicate had been involved and enough to understand the response would not be gentle. Damian didn't need to explain it. The calm certainty in his eyes did the work. He conveyed that the immediate threat was contained, and that whoever had pushed this boundary would not get to do it again anytime soon. For now, those two invisible words hung in the air anyway. I felt them in the way people avoided looking directly at Ruby and me, as if acknowledging our presence made the situation more personal than they wanted it to be. I felt them in the way Noah's shoulders stayed rigid even after he exhaled, like his body didn't trust peace. Someone guided us toward the kitchen, not as an invitation, but as a practical move to get the children away from shattered glass and the smell of alarmed metal. I carried Ruby, even though she was big enough to walk, because my arms needed the proof of her weight. Eli followed with quiet steps, his face calm again, but his fingers kept flexing at his sides like he couldn't decide whether to hold on to something or let go. In the kitchen, the light was softer. The counters were clean. The order of the room felt almost insulting after what we'd just left. I filled a kettle with water because doing something normal is how I keep myself from unraveling. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not wildly, just a fine tremor that made the water splash and my grip slip. I pressed my palms flat on the counter until my fingers steadied enough to continue. Ruby climbed onto a stool and wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She looked smaller here, swallowed by the quiet. Eli leaned against the doorway, posture too controlled, eyes tracking every sound from the hall. When the kettle started to hiss, I realized my breathing had been shallow for too long. I forced in a deeper breath, then another, as if oxygen itself was a decision. Damian appeared without announcement, the way he always did, but this time the room didn't change for him as much. He looked tired in a way that stripped away polish. He watched my shaking hands, then Ruby's careful face, then Eli's rigid stillness. For a moment, something in his expression softened into a kind of regret that didn't ask for forgiveness but couldn't be hidden either. He conveyed an apology without dressing it up, an acknowledgement that my life and Ruby's had been pulled into a storm we didn't choose. The weight of it landed in my chest, heavy and complicated. Part of me wanted to throw my anger at him like a weapon. Part of me wanted to believe his protection was the only reason we were still standing in this kitchen at all. I didn't give him comfort. I didn't give him absolution. I gave him the truth of my eyes. That I was terrified, that I was furious, and that I was still going to keep these children breathing. Damian's gaze held mine for one long beat, and I saw something honest there, exhaustion, restraint, and a promise that didn't feel romantic. It felt logistical. It felt like the kind of promise made by someone who knows exactly what it costs to keep it. Then Noah's phone buzzed somewhere in the hall, and the air changed again. Not alarms, not red lights, just the subtle tightening of a new update arriving. Damian turned away to receive it, already shifting back into the man who moves pieces on a board so his son can sleep. I poured the tea anyway, steam rising between my shaking hands like a fragile shield. Ruby cupped the warm mug and looked up at me with trust that nearly broke me. Eli stayed near the doorway, listening, waiting, and as I stood there in a mountain kitchen that looked untouched, I felt the shape of the next loss approaching like weather, because whatever happened tonight had been contained here. But my old life was still back in Chicago, unprotected by stone and glass, and I could feel it like a string pulled tight waiting for someone to cut it. Morning came without sunlight, just a pale gray that seeped through the glass like water. I moved on autopilot, boiling eggs, cutting toast into small squares the way Ruby liked, wiping a counter that was already clean. The house felt quieter after the alarms, but the quiet had teeth. Every time a door latched, my shoulders jumped. Ruby sat at the table in her pajamas, humming softly, trying to make this another sleepover. Eli watched the hallway between bites, listening for radios that weren't there. I kept smiling anyway, because if I broke, 2 children would learn fear is permanent. Damian passed the kitchen once, phone at his ear, eyes fixed on something beyond the walls. He didn't slow down, but the men outside the room shifted when he moved, like metal filings obeying a magnet. Noah checked the exterior cameras, then checked them again, as if yesterday's math might change overnight. I packed Ruby's backpack with crayons and a spare sweater, stupid little normal things, and my hands still trembled. Eli tried to help by stacking plates perfectly. Perfection was his comfort blanket. I saw it in his jaw, the way he swallowed feelings as if they were dangerous. Later, Damian finally stopped long enough to look at me. Really look, and the air tightened. He held himself steady, but there was a faint edge in his exhaustion, as if he'd spent the night buying time. He conveyed the update with the same controlled economy he used for everything. The Crow Syndicate wanted a message that would stick, and they chose the easiest symbol. My book-café in Chicago had been hit before dawn. Not a warning note this time. Fire and ruin. Insurance paperwork wouldn't bring back the shelves I built with my own hands or Ruby's laughter there. I expected to scream. Instead, I went numb, like my body unplugged to survive. I saw the place in flashes. The crooked chalkboard menu, the corner chair where Ruby colored while I steamed milk, the stack of donated paperbacks that always smelled like other people's homes. I remembered the first day I opened, holding the key with shaking excitement, believing hard work could be a shield. Now my shield was ash. Ruby asked if our cafe would be okay, and I heard myself answer with a softness that felt fake even to me. I pulled her close and nodded anyway. Anger arrived after the numbness, hot and clean, not just at the Crow Syndicate, but at the universe that kept testing single mothers like we were disposable. I had followed the rules. I had worked late, paid taxes, taught Ruby to say please and thank you. None of that stopped a rival's message from landing on my doorstep. The truth settled in with brutal clarity. There was no going back to the life I'd been trying to protect. That life had already been chosen as leverage, and leverage gets destroyed. I stared at my hands and realized survival wasn't enough. Damian didn't offer comfort the way normal men do. He offered structure. He laid out, in careful pieces, the work he'd been doing for years, cleaning the edges of his empire, investing in real estate that passed audits, backing tech firms that didn't ask questions, buying art through legitimate channels, moving money into daylight one transaction at a time. He didn't pretend it made him innocent. He framed it as an exit ramp built under pressure. The Crow Syndicate saw that shift as weakness. Damian saw it as the only way Eli could grow up without drills and without cages. Then he introduced the new offer, and I felt the deal tilt under my feet. He had a foundation already forming on paper, an education initiative meant to look clean to the public and to be real in practice. Scholarships, community learning centers, after-school programs in neighborhoods that get ignored until something bad happens. He wanted me attached to it, not as a face but as a builder. An education partner who could design programs, hire tutors, set standards, and keep Eli's needs at the center without turning him into a headline. Protection, yes, but also purpose with receipts today. My first instinct was suspicion dressed as pride. I told myself he was trying to buy a conscience, to use my credibility as a shield the way he used stone and glass. I pictured board meetings where people smiled too hard, cameras flashing, my name stamped on something I didn't understand. I remembered the NDA, the way Vera's paperwork had turned my life into a line item. But then I watched Damian's eyes when he looked at Eli. They weren't soft, but they were honest. He wanted a future, and he was to pay for it in ways that hurt. Ruby didn't care about syndicates or foundations. She cared about whether the pancakes were shaped like hearts, and whether Eli would laugh at her knock-knock jokes. That morning, she slid her little pebble into Eli's rock box again, as if gifts could fix fear. Eli hesitated, then smiled, small, real, and I felt my chest loosen. This was what mattered. Not my pride, not my lease. 2 children trying to stay children. If a foundation could carve out safer classrooms, safer hours, safer mornings like this, maybe saying yes wasn't surrender. Maybe it was a way to fight without breaking. I didn't accept with gratitude. I accepted with conditions and a knot of caution in my stomach. I told myself I would watch every contract, ask every question, refuse any charity that was really control. I would build programs that served kids who looked like my neighbors, not just kids behind gates. I would make sure Ruby stayed protected, not paraded. And I would keep Eli's humanity at the center, even when the men with radios forgot he was 7. The decision clicked into place like a lock. My old life was gone. The next one had to mean something. While Vera handled logistics and Noah arranged routes, I sat alone with my phone and scrolled through old contacts I hadn't touched in years. I didn't know why. Maybe grief makes you search for patterns. Damian's people warned the Crow Syndicate couldn't have found my cafe that fast without help. Someone had fed them my address, my schedule, Ruby's school details. Those weren't public. My mind went to the chapter of my life I never mention. The one I buried before Ruby was born. A name surfaced, sharp as glass. I understood the next blow might come from behind me. The days after I said yes to the foundation role looked almost normal from a distance. Breakfast at the same time. Eli's lessons in the same sunny corner. Ruby's crayons spread across the table like tiny flags claiming space. The guards rotated shifts outside, quiet as shadows, and the cameras blinked their patient little red lights. That was the new normal domestic life wrapped in surveillance. I kept telling myself the danger was contained, that it lived in Damian's world and we were just passing through it until it settled. Then I saw my own past printed on clean paper. Vera brought me a slim folder meant to help lock down information flows. The kind of phrase that sounded corporate until you remembered it was about keeping children alive. Inside were call logs, access points, and a timeline built from security footage, burned cafe reports, and digital traces Damian's team had collected. I skimmed with the numb focus of someone reading a medical chart. And then my eyes snagged on a line item that made my stomach flip. An email address I knew the way you know a scar on your own skin, followed by a phone number ending in the same last 4 digits I used to see light up my screen years ago. Jason Reed. Even thinking his name felt like stepping on broken glass. He wasn't a stranger who drifted through my life. He was someone who once knew my routines before I learned to hide them. Someone who knew which mornings Ruby had preschool, which afternoons I did inventory, which nights I stayed late counting cash. Someone who knew my weak spots because he helped create them. I hadn't spoken to him since before Ruby could form full sentences. But the paper didn't care about my distance. The paper only cared about access. My first reaction was denial dressed as logic. I told myself it had to be coincidence, that numbers get recycled, that names repeat. Then I saw a detail that didn't belong to anyone else. A note about an old landlord contact used as a bridge, and a small mention of a payment routed through a property management account. Jason used to talk about property like it was a game. He had once tried to get me to sign a lease through a friend, to help, a favor that would have tied my address to his paper trail. I remembered refusing, proud and stubborn, and the memory turned bitter when I realized he didn't need my signature to watch me. He only needed time and resentment. Anger came so fast it made my vision blur. Not the kind of anger that looks dramatic. The kind that makes your hands go cold and your mouth taste like pennies. Ruby. Her ribbon color. Her school pickup time. Those details had been on the threat. I had believed the Crow Syndicate was aiming at Damian, and we were collateral. But this was personal in a different way. Someone had handed my child's life over like a receipt. Humiliation burned behind my eyes because it wasn't just betrayal, it was the proof that my past could still reach into Ruby's present. I wanted to blame myself. That reflex is built into women like me, like a second spine. If I hadn't dated him, if I hadn't trusted him, if I hadn't built a cafe where people could find me, if I hadn't opened a door in a storm, the thoughts lined up like accusations, each one trying to convince me I deserved this. I stared at Ruby across the room, her feet swinging as she colored a sun with a purple crayon, and I felt something steadier push back. I was allowed to have a past. I was allowed to leave it. And Ruby was allowed to be safe anyway. When Damian reviewed the same folder, I braced for the kind of response his reputation promised. I pictured fury spilling over, men moving, a fast and brutal fix. My body prepared for it before my mind did, muscles tight, breath shallow. The protective urge to pull Ruby behind me even inside a fortress. But Damian's face didn't sharpen into violence. It sharpened into focus. He became quieter, not louder. And that quiet was somehow more reassuring than rage. He moved like a man choosing a line he would not cross, even when crossing it would be easier. Instead of a storm, he built a cage out of paperwork and proof. He directed Vera to trace the payments cleanly, to map every transfer, every shell, every convenient consulting fee that smelled like laundering. He instructed Noah to lock down my digital footprint, new numbers, new accounts, new channels, no loose ends. He ordered an evidence packet assembled with chain of custody precision, the kind that stands up in court instead of collapsing into rumor. I understood what he was doing, cutting the money channels the Crow Syndicate used, then putting a legal spotlight on whoever touched them. Not revenge. Containment. Watching him choose restraint made me feel dizzy in a different way. I had been afraid his power meant chaos. But this was power as stability, boring, relentless, undeniable. Financial choke points, civil pressure, tax exposure, protective orders. Corporate compliance used like armor, a strategy that didn't require Ruby to hear shouting or see men dragged away in the night. Damian wasn't pretending to be clean. He was acting like a man determined to become cleaner, because the children demanded it. That choice shifted something inside me, small but real. It didn't erase what he was. It didn't rewrite the past week into something safe, but it changed the shape of my fear. I'd been living inside the assumption that men like him only knew one language. Now I saw he was learning another, even when it cost him pride and speed. I hated that it surprised me. I also couldn't deny the relief it brought. Later, when Ruby fell asleep with crayon smudges on her fingers, and Eli finally let his shoulders drop while he read, I sat alone with the folder closed on the table. My past had crawled back into my life wearing a new mask, and it hurt in a way that felt older than this crisis. But the house was quiet. Not fake quiet this time, managed quiet. And I realized safety wasn't just walls and guards and codes. It might be the way Damian chose to act when he had every excuse not to. I looked down the hall where Eli's small silhouette moved between shadows and lamplight, and I thought about what it would mean to build something that outlasted fear. A foundation, a program, a real chance for kids like him and kids like Ruby. The leak had come from my past, but it didn't get to decide my future. And for the first time in days, I let myself believe that the family forming in this strange place wasn't only made of survival, it might be made of choices. The house didn't feel like it was holding its breath anymore. The cameras were still there. The guards still rotated. Noah still checked the perimeter like it was a prayer he repeated with his hands. But the sharp edge had dulled, the kind of calm that isn't denial, more like a wound finally clotting. I noticed it in small ways. My shoulders didn't jump every time a door clicked shut. Eli stopped scanning every window before he sat down. Ruby asked for pancakes again, like we were just living. I built routines the way I used to build my cafe displays, carefully, with intention, with a little hope tucked behind practicality. Mornings became lesson time. Late mornings became foundation time. Vera sending drafts and budgets and timelines that made my head ache in a different, more normal way. I'd sit at the long table with a laptop, a mug of coffee, and a notepad full of ideas for tutoring programs in neighborhoods like mine. The kind of places where kids need a warm room and a patient adult more than they need another lecture about potential. And the kids started acting like they believed tomorrow would arrive. Ruby and Eli became siblings by circumstance in a way that didn't happen in one big moment. It happened in crumbs and crayons and shared silence. Ruby would slide extra pretzels onto Eli's plate without making a big deal of it. Eli would pretend he didn't notice, then quietly make sure Ruby's cup stayed filled, like it was his job to keep her safe. They built little worlds on the floor with blocks and books, Ruby narrating with dramatic hand motions, Eli adding structural details so the castle didn't collapse. Sometimes Ruby would fall asleep mid-coloring, her cheek pressed into the table, and Eli would gently place her blanket over her with the careful precision of someone trained, except the tenderness in his hands wasn't trained. It was chosen. One night I found them in the living room, heads bent over a notebook. Ruby had drawn a lopsided sun and labeled it with backward letters. Eli had drawn a set of constellations around it, mapping stars like he was giving her a sky she could keep. They didn't look up when I came in. They weren't performing. They were just together. That's the thing I didn't know I'd been starving for. A life where my child wasn't always watching me for cues of danger. I still carried vigilance like a second skin. I checked exits in every room without thinking. I kept Ruby's shoes near the door. I memorized the quickest path to Eli's study, and the pantry and the hallway where the panic room had been hidden. But the vigilance stopped being panic. It became preparedness, the kind that lets you breathe. And somewhere in that shift, my single mom instincts changed shape. I've spent years believing help always comes with a price. Sometimes the price is obvious, like rent. Sometimes it's quiet, like dignity. Accepting support used to feel like standing under a ceiling that might collapse. I'd brace, waiting for the catch. Now I was still braced, but I was starting to notice something new. Damian didn't rush my trust. He didn't demand gratitude. He didn't act like my yes to the foundation meant I belonged to him. He made space. It showed up in how he entered rooms. If Ruby was telling a story with her whole body, Damian paused at the doorway instead of cutting through it, letting her finish her performance like it mattered. If Eli was struggling through a reading passage and finally let out a breathy laugh when he got it right, Damian didn't step closer and steal the moment. He stayed where he was and let the laughter land. He watched like a man learning what he'd missed. One afternoon, I was sorting foundation notes while Ruby and Eli worked on a puzzle at the table. Damian walked in, then stopped when he saw the mess of pieces and pencil marks. He didn't ask them to tidy up. He didn't instruct staff to fix it. He just placed a small plate of sliced apples within Ruby's reach and another near Eli's elbow, then stepped back as if he were afraid to disrupt the fragile normal. The gesture was quiet, but I felt the meaning of it. He wasn't trying to take over. He was trying to participate without claiming. It hit me harder than anything dramatic ever could, because it felt like permission-seeking, like he was saying, in the only language he trusted, that he respected the boundary of our little world, that he understood Ruby was mine to protect, and if he wanted a place in her life, he had to earn it like anyone else. My chest tightened with something that wasn't fear. Later, when Ruby needed help brushing her hair and Eli was distracted by a book about planets, Damian stood near the hallway mirror while I worked a knot out of Ruby's curls. I could feel his attention, not possessive observant, like he was learning the rhythm of a family he didn't know how to hold. I caught his reflection watching my hands, the gentle way I steadied Ruby's chin, the way Ruby leaned into me with absolute trust. Damian's face softened so briefly I almost doubted it. But I didn't. I let myself keep it. The Linda Carter moment arrived when I least expected it. A call that Vera put through after triple-checking the number, as if my mother's voice could be another kind of threat. Hearing her name made my throat close. My relationship with my mom has always been complicated love wrapped in disappointment, worry tangled with old arguments. She'd helped when Ruby was a baby, then pulled back when life got messy, the way some people do when they don't know what to say. I'd told myself I didn't need her. I'd told myself pride was protection. But when her voice came through, shaky and familiar, it knocked something loose inside me. She didn't need to say much for the moment to matter. I pictured her in her small kitchen back in Illinois, probably holding her phone with both hands, probably blinking too hard. I imagined her asking about Ruby with a careful tenderness, the kind that admits she's scared she lost her chance. Ruby leaned into my side while I listened, her little fingers rubbing circles on my wrist like she sensed the ache underneath. I let myself soften, just a little. I let my mother back into the story, not because everything was fixed, but because chosen family doesn't erase blood. It just refuses to be trapped by it. When the call ended, Ruby asked if Grandma Linda could visit someday, and I felt the answer form in me like a promise I'd been too afraid to make before. Someday didn't feel impossible anymore. That night, after the kids fell asleep, Ruby sprawled sideways with her blanket half on. Eli curled up with a book open on his chest. I stood at the window and watched the mountain trees sway. The world outside was dark and quiet. Inside, the house hummed softly with steady systems and sleeping children. Damian stood a few feet away, not close enough to crowd me, close enough to share the silence. I didn't need words to understand what had changed. Trust hadn't arrived like fireworks. It had arrived like dawn, slow, undeniable, earned. I thought about the storm that started this whole thing, about the door I opened and the life I lost. And for the first time, the loss didn't feel like only grief. It felt like a turning point, like kindness had a cost, yes, but it also had a direction. I didn't know yet what I was willing to call this life, but I could feel the final question coming, steady as a heartbeat. If this is a family we're choosing, what future am I brave enough to claim? That night in Chicago, the storm felt like it was only weather. Rain on glass, wind shaking the cafe sign, a soaked little boy under my awning. I thought I was making one decision that would last a few minutes. I didn't understand I was opening a door that would wash my old life right off the map. Now, when I think about that storm, I don't picture the thunder first. I picture what it revealed. How thin my normal really was. How fast safety can change shape. How kindness can cost you in ways you never budgeted for. And still, how it can rebuild you, piece by piece, if you keep choosing it anyway. I used to believe safety meant locks, rules, keeping your head down and hoping trouble passed you by. But I learned something I can't unlearn. Safety is also a decision. It's what people do when they have power, when no one is watching, when the easy path is cruelty. I watched Damian make hard choices the clean way when he could have chosen the loud way. I watched him put the children first, even when it meant slowing down and swallowing pride. That's what changed everything. Not money, not walls, not the myth of fear, choices, over and over, until trust had something real to stand on. Tonight, the house is quiet in a way that feels earned. Ruby is in her pajamas, curled up with a book that's almost too big for her hands. Eli sits close enough to share the light, pointing at pictures with the careful patience he used to save for emergencies. I move through the kitchen like I belong here, tea steaming, socks on cold tile, my heartbeat steady instead of sprinting. Damian is nearby, not hovering, not demanding, just present, like a man learning how to be gentle on purpose. We didn't forget the darkness. We survived it. We drew boundaries. We rebuilt. And somehow, in the middle of all that, a family happened one chosen moment at a time. So I have to ask you, if you'd seen that child in the storm, would you have opened the door? And tell me where you're watching from. I read the comments more than you might think. If this story made you feel something, please like, share, and leave a comment, because sometimes the smallest choice is the one that changes everything.